So it's great to be here tonight and to talk with you about confident pluralism. And I'll be drawing this is a bit of a hybrid talk that will draw some from the book and some from an article that I recently wrote with Tim Keller that tries to bridge this a little bit more for a distinctively Christian applications of some of this, and we can, in the Q&A, sort of tease out what the differences might be and how they relate to each other. But to start it off, the premise of the book and the premise for writing is the factual description that we have these deep and irreconcilable differences in our country and our society, and they're not going away. They're, in some ways, maybe even getting worse. So we have to figure out what to do with them, and we see this especially in the current election season. I had this manuscript submitted well before the primaries, but with each step it feels like this sense of difference and discord is getting larger and larger. And we see this not only in candidates in politicking, but also in our own personal reactions. So think about how you react to the word evangelical or conservative or progressive or Black Lives Matter or Muslim or atheist, and these labels of people sort of trigger different kinds of thoughts and point to some of our differences. And what's odd about that is that we talk as Americans a lot about our unity. So we talk about being one nation, indivisible, and in pursuit of a more perfect union. But in our actual existence, we see more disagreement than unity. And when we press on the hard issues, we disagree about the purpose of our country, the nature of the common good, whether we have a common good, the meaning of human flourishing. And these differences go all throughout our preferences and our beliefs and our tastes. And they affect not just what we think, but how we see the world. So we can actually end up seeing the same event from two very different perspectives, and in some ways irreconcilable perspectives, which leads us to the fact of pluralism. There is difference in society. We're stuck with the good and the bad and the ugly of those differences, and that gives us a practical problem that calls for a political solution. How do we navigate those differences? Rousseau gave us one answer. He said, "It is impossible for men to live in peace with those they think are damned." So I sort of somewhat optimistically hope that Rousseau is wrong, and want to suggest this different possibility of confident pluralism, which says that a kind of shared existence is necessary and possible. It's not the elusive goal of unity. It is instead a more modest suggestion that in our manyness and in our differences, we can find a way to live together. That means, though, recognizing the differences for what they are and finding common existence in spite of them. So it's a bit of a limited and modest vision, maybe. As I say in the book, this is not the American dream, but the hope is that it avoids the American nightmare. I think for some people, and some Christians especially, the need for confident pluralism, or the need for some practical solution to a political problem, is just recently beginning to dawn. And that's especially true for white Protestants, of which I am half of one, which is to say I'm half white, not half Protestant. And one of the reasons that this challenge and the challenges of pluralism are tricky in some of these white Protestant circles is that as recently as half a century ago, our public and cultural norms were really underwritten by a distinctly American Protestant culture in the white middle class. This had its own sense of diversity, and so when you compare it to certain European countries with national churches, the American experiment was in its own way diverse and facilitated denominations and difference, but you were still generally assumed to be going to some church of your choice, whatever it was. And as a consequence, the affiliation with Protestant churches largely of one sort or another contributed to a kind of social identity for many Americans, the vast majority of the US population, and again, this is only a couple generations ago, even if they weren't devout, identified with some church and its basic teachings, and those teachings contributed in good and in bad ways to a monolithic kind of thinking about things like religion and morality. Well, that was then. It's not the case today. As the Catholic writer Joseph Bottom has suggested, the single most significant fact over the past few decades in this country is the crumbling of mainline Protestant churches as central institutions in our national experience. Whatever one thinks of the main line today, Bottom is right that it once provided institutional frameworks that sustained the Protestant culture, and it's not there anymore. Now, I think the reality of these cultural and institutional changes is a kind of a mixed blessing. It comes with some loss, but it also brings a fair number of gains, both in terms of American culture and, I would suggest, Christian theology. The current circumstances might remind us anew, as Christians, of a theological identity as resident aliens, sort of a distinctiveness apart from a kind of culture. And Christians who trace an institutional heritage to this Protestant culture of old can begin to learn from others whose knowledge and experience and living has been quite different, especially other Christians and other religious believers who, because of race or class, were never actually functionally part of this Protestant culture in the first place. But regardless of what one thinks about sort of then to now, the reality is that there's no going back to a different nostalgic time. There's no retrieval to be had. And that idea that sometimes appears, even today in some Christian thought, is not only impractical, but it ends up being tone deaf to a number of our fellow citizens. Going back to the 1950s is not a great bargain for African Americans. Going back to the 1940s is not a win for Japanese Americans like my grandparents who were interned during World War II. So the very real and pressing question today is not how we go back or recover something from the past, but how we engage in the present for what it is. Confident pluralism offers one answer to that question, and it's the idea that we can embrace pluralism because we are confident in our own beliefs and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. It takes both confidence and pluralism seriously. Confidence without pluralism misses the reality of politics. It ends up suppressing difference and sometimes with violence. On the other hand, pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ignores and trivializes difference for the sake of a kind of false unity. Confident pluralism insists on recognizing real difference and assuming that it exists and allowing people to hold to their strongly held convictions. The purpose is not to settle which views are right and which views are wrong. So you can think of this entire argument and effort as trying to set up a sort of procedure through which we can make arguments with one another, giving people room to disagree and allowing meaningful space for difference that comes with the opportunity for persuasion. So tonight I'll talk about both the importance of protecting difference in groups, but also allowing for people to engage across difference. There is in the argument both a legal and a personal dimension to this. The legal dimension says that we need the right kinds of laws and the right kinds of constitutional practices to allow for difference to thrive. And the personal side, this idea of civic practices, suggests that when the law runs out, when we are given spaces to do what we want, that we need to figure out how to engage with empathy, how to choose to limit our own speech and discourse for the sake of others, and the two are going to have to work together. Our own history suggests that when we, despite our best intentions, when we end up in a majority position or end up taking power, we tend to suppress difference that disagrees with us. So the challenge is, how do we build in practices now to guard against that? So I want to start with the legal or the constitutional side of this idea. And I'm going to talk tonight about two different legal doctrines. The first is what the Supreme Court has called the right of expressive association. So I'll just give you two legal terms to remember tonight: expressive association, and the second one is called the public forum. And these sort of frame some of the arguments in my chapters. Both of these doctrines, in their right sense, ought to protect and guard meaningful difference, but both are currently deeply flawed in their applications and in the way that courts interpret them. So part of the argument here is, if we as a country are going to make this work, we need some reforms to the laws that we currently have. So let me start with expressive association. The basic idea here is that the groups of civil society that form in private spaces are properly free from government interference, absent an extraordinarily justifying or extraordinary compelling justification. So we want to do maximal protections for private groups. We're not talking about public spaces, but the groups that we form on our own choosing. The problem is that the current right of expressive association does not adequately protect these boundaries. Instead of recognizing the importance of groups for what they are, remember the name, expressive association. The entire doctrine points to what and whether a group expresses. But when you think about how groups actually work, think about the groups of which you're a part, your churches, your schools, neighborhood associations, fraternities, and sororities. These are not just expressive groups. You and I find meaning and value in belonging to a group, in identifying, in the internal discussions that we have, in the informal interactions that we have. In the sense of belonging, I was actually on the way in here from the airport yesterday, passing the new Viking Stadium, and the law professor with me from Minnesota was saying, you know, people here really identify with the Vikings too, right? So we all have these groups, and for me it's Duke and Wisconsin, right? And these contribute in ways that are not just expressive. They're a kind of identity forming way about us, and when you move from sort of sports teams, which as fun as they can be, don't actually get to the things that matter for most people, and to the other kinds of groups in life. Now we're talking about deeply formative kinds of practices. Expressive association that says, just look at what the group says, misses that background formation. It also creates an artificial distinction in the law between groups that are purportedly expressive and those that are non-expressive. So as you think about this, can you conjure up in your mind a list of groups that are entirely non-expressive? It's hard to do because most groups at least have some expressive capacity, and a legal distinction that rules out some groups as non-expressive forgets the fact that all kinds of acts can be expressive. When I join a group, that can be expressive. If I don't join a group, if I speak or don't speak, the gamut of expression runs much farther than a formally expressive parameter. And we have examples of this from the law. So one that I discuss in the book is from the Top Hatters Motorcycle Club, which is a California biker gang founded in 1947. And in 2000, 4 members of the Top Hatters went to the Gilroy Garlic Festival. Does anyone know Gilroy, California? It's the garlic capital of the world, right, with an annual garlic festival. So this is a big deal in Gilroy. And the Top Hatters, these 4 guys, wanted to celebrate one of their birthdays at the festival, and they show up, perhaps not unexpectedly, in their biker gear, including leather denim vests that have the insignia of the club, which is a skull with wings. The Gilroy police meet them at the entry to the festival and say, you're wearing gang colors, you can't come in here, and they deny them and escort them out of the festival. So this sort of floats around in the courts for a while and gets to a federal lawsuit. And the important fact from that lawsuit for this discussion is that a federal court said this motorcycle club, the Top Hatters, are a non-expressive association. So they claim a First Amendment right and say, you can't kick us out, we're a group, we have rights. And the court says, no, you're a non-expressive association, we don't care about any kind of core rights or protections you have. They didn't lose on any kind of an argument that said the state has a stronger interest than your claim, they just said, we don't care about what your claim is. And when you look and think about who the Top Hatters are, that seems odd. So let me read to you some of the group's statements. Their functions are for the benefit of the community. Their number one priority is strengthening the brotherhood in the biker community. They maintain a strong regard for family, for brotherhood, and for motorcycling. And the list goes on. And you can even, on your own time, go to the Top Hatters website and see their pictures and their parties and their livelihood. It's very hard to say that none of that is expressive, right, or deeply formative to the members of the group, and yet the court said you don't count. This perplexing analysis about a motorcycle club gets even harder when you think about the online context of many groups today. So a website, a blog, a Twitter account, these are all inherently expressive. So think about any group, even a group that someone wants to say is not expressive. If they have a website, they're expressing something. And so this legal line of expressive association is deeply confused. And the problem with this kind of loose doctrine and ambiguity is that it defaults to let decision makers fill in their own arbitrary judgments. So who's to say the motorcycle club is not expressive or not protected? Well, some judge is to say, and we can see how that could repeat in problematic ways over time. None of this is to say that the motorcycle club should win or should have an absolute protection, but it is to say that as we think about the kinds of constitutional frameworks we have for groups, we ought to at least recognize their upfront significance to people and then let officials and courts decide whether those particular claims are balanced out by different sorts of government interests. So that's expressive association. And the idea here, if you want to sort of have a shorthand for expressive association, is we have to have maximal protections for private groups to exist on their own terms and to their own standards. We also, in conjunction with that, have to allow spaces for these groups to come together and to allow for the possibility of discourse. And this is the doctrine of the public forum. This is the constitutionally required spaces provided by the government where groups can come together. And there's a long history of the public forum in our country. The most traditional examples are city parks or city sidewalks, and the idea here is they're government owned and government facilitated, but anyone can go there to say anything, subject to some outer regulations. There are also, on a public campus like this one, there are spaces on campus that are designated as public forums. And one of the fundamental norms there is the government can't say who gets to come and who doesn't get to come. If you come on your own terms and you make your own arguments on your own terms. This also plays out in non-physical settings. Student groups make up public forums. These ideas, which are embedded in our country's history, are essential to our democratic practices. They're a practical mechanism for groups to gather in public spaces, to make arguments to one another, sometimes just to let off steam, to make public statements, to talk to officials, sometimes just to talk to themselves. And when you think about how this plays out in practice, I mean, most or many universities have these sort of spaces where, a lot of odd ducks can show up and do things, right? And that's part of the experiment of living together in society, is that you tolerate this kind of range of expressions, sometimes discomfort, sometimes in the outer bounds, even a sort of instability. And that the willingness to tolerate this dissent and this difference is a sign of a healthy democracy. These intuitive connections were not lost on the writers of one of my favorite television shows, Parks and Recreation. In season 2, a delegation from a municipal Parks and Rec from Venezuela comes to the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana, and the delegation's leader, Raul, expresses dismay upon seeing a public forum in Pawnee. He says, "This is outrageous. Where are the armed men who come in to take the protesters away? Where are they? This kind of behavior is never tolerated where I'm from. If you shout like that, they put you in jail. Right away, no trial, no nothing. Journalists, we have a special place for journalists." So we laugh at Raul's observation, and yet we're not as far away from that vision as we might like to believe in parts of this country. The suppression of public outrage in the days immediately following the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, including the detention of national and international journalists who covered the protests, is just one example of ongoing violations of the public forum right here in this country. And what's interesting about this particular doctrine is that it cuts across the ideological spectrum. Local government officials regulate and over-regulate the public forum when it comes to political protests from both parties, from labor activists, anti-abortion protesters, churches, Occupy Wall Street, and the list goes on and on. The desire to control and to contain and to regulate the public forum is really pervasive and ends up either silencing or curtailing expression from across a great range of groups and voices. So there are two problems then. The right of association and the public forum both need resolution, both need improvement in order for us to functionally live well together. The second aspect of what is essential for us to move forward together are the decisions that we make every day outside of the bounds of law and policy, where no court and no government official tells us what to do. But these are also important, particularly because when we think about it, they play out in our daily lives much more frequently than the court decision that usually occupies our attention. And ultimately, the way that we treat each other when the law doesn't tell us what to do is going to have a feedback into what we say the law is down the road. And so the norms that we institute for ourselves and our own practices are ultimately tied to the law. So in this space of what we do, I focus on three aspirations: tolerance, humility, and patience. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. When you think about them, they're not self-evidently confident words. So you might think of them as concessions, right? I will be tolerant of you, or I will be patient if I don't have to. But actually, I want to suggest that tolerance, humility, and patience can unfold even in light of our firmly held convictions. When we have confidence in our own views and we believe them to be the better ones, we can engage charitably with others. Instead of resisting other voices or removing ourselves to our own echo chambers, we can pursue dialogue and coexistence precisely because we believe that our views are better and will be subject to critique and engagement. So let me say a little bit about each of these three aspirations and then talk about some practical ways that we might think about embodying these in our own lives. Start with tolerance. Tolerance is the recognition that for the most part, people are free to pursue their own beliefs and their own practices, even those that we find morally objectionable. Now that sounds good maybe in theory, but it's very hard to apply in practice. As one philosopher said, tolerance is most needed only for the intolerable. So we have a bit of a paradox in trying to tolerate people in practice. But I don't think that tolerance, and the word tolerance, especially on a university campus, is subject to some different definitions. The kind of tolerance I'm talking about does not mean embracing all beliefs as good or right. Instead of sort of an anything goes tolerance, this is a practical enduring of difference for the sake of coexistence. It does not mean approval. It does mean distinguishing between people and ideas. Tolerance says we treat people with respect. It doesn't mean respecting all ideas. And when we think about this, this is critical. All of us hold ideas that other people find unpersuasive, inconsistent, even crazy. And all of us hold views that other people find morally reprehensible. Tolerance does not impose the fiction that all ideas are equally valid or morally harmless, but it means respecting people and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. That's tolerance. The next is humility, which goes a step more. Humility says that we recognize not only others will find our own beliefs objectionable, but also that we won't always have a response that can prove to them why we are right and why they are wrong. Put differently, humility recognizes that some of our own beliefs are going to rest upon values and assertions that cannot be proven or justified outside of our own communities and our own traditions. This is based on the limits of what we can prove, not on claims about what is true. So this is not relativism, and that's an important distinction. There are versions of humility and there are versions of pluralism that lead to relativism. I'm not interested in a kind of relativistic arguments. Our beliefs can be true, and they can even be known. We know lots of things we can't prove. We know what we ate for breakfast last week, or at least some of us remember that. We know that we're loved, and sometimes that we're not loved. This is a kind of knowledge that can also extend to our moral beliefs. And many of us are confident about contested moral beliefs. We hold them even though others reject them. Humility does not question this confidence, but it calls for a recognition that our beliefs stem from contested premises that others don't share. It also recognizes that our own human faculties are inherently limited, and our ability to think and to reason and to reflect is less than perfect. That is one reason that all of us in this world, whether we're religious or not, live and act on a kind of faith in the beliefs that we hold. And finally, patience. Patience points toward a kind of persistence and endurance that also sometimes means restraint. It encourages efforts to listen and to understand, perhaps even to empathize. That's not the same as affirmation or agreement. And in some, and perhaps many cases, patient listening and patient dialogue might lead us to conclude that the beliefs were just as wrong and crazy as we thought they were, or to see that the more profound error or harm in someone else's views. But I think we can at least assume a posture that leaves open a different possibility, that moves beyond caricatured dismissals of others before we even hear what they have to say. All of this, I think, tolerance, patience, and humility, lets us think about creative partnerships across difference. And one key insight here, I think, is we're not necessarily looking to overcome ideological difference. Remember the premise that started this talk. These differences may not be going away, but we can build relational differences, bridge relational differences across ideologies. We can start by finding out what common ground we share, instead of searching for entirely agreeable common good. So let me mention then 3 examples of where this kind of approach of tolerance, humility, and patience can play out in practice. And I'll specifically address Christians, and then we can talk afterward about whether this is more broadly applicable. And the first, I think, is in the realm of government and politics. And we can learn that political engagement does not always have to come from a position of power. Political engagement of any kind is going to be messy, and it will require judgment and wisdom about how and when to engage. And it's important to tell stories to each other when this engagement happens, both at a national and at a local level. That politics for the sake of others, with confidence in the gospel, can make meaningful differences in people's lives. And this is true whether in the pure political space, or lawyers or judges or police officers or others who work to sustain the social fabric. There's a line floating around in some academic discussions that says politics always follows culture. Start with culture first. And I recently heard the Washington Post columnist Mike Gerson say, that's the kind of line that is most often said by those who have the luxury of reflecting on culture, right? But that in fact, for many people, politics is a matter of life and death. It's an urgent need. And this is particularly true in places of our country and our cities where the social fabric is torn. Christians have a role to play in these settings, not as self-interested rulers, but as active participants seeking the good of our neighbors. That will necessarily mean engagement across difference. It will mean looking for common ground and partnering with groups and people who don't agree with you on everything or even most things. The second area, which is has received a lot of attention both here in this city and in St. Louis and across the country, is renewed attention to issues of racial justice and structural racism. There are tremendous resources in Christianity to bridge racial divisions. And this is something that has not yet entered the national narrative as much as it needs to. Part of that dialogue, though, will be recognizing how much frustration has outpaced hope for many people of color and communities of color, and listening to Christians, especially Christians of color who have been in these spaces, hearing their concerns, hearing their wisdom, and hearing what it means to partner with them, both in terms of personal relationships, but also structural challenges like education, like criminal justice, like housing. And in the midst of this listening and this engagement on racial injustice, I think we can also pay greater attention to the power of protest and the significance of dissent. You all have confronted some of this in Minneapolis and in St. Louis as well. We've seen protests very visible and navigating different forms and different versions of protests. On a national level, we've seen this even in the past few weeks with symbolic protests around the national anthem led by Colin Kaepernick's refusal to stand. So how might we think about the meaning of an engagement with protests? I don't have a complete answer here, but let me throw out at a minimum what I think are 3 considerations for Christians to think about. One, we ought to honor and protect the right to dissent, almost no matter what. And so even if we disagree with the proposition, we should honor dissent. Second, we ought to remember that our ultimate allegiance is to God and not to any country or nation state. And third, we ought to strive for empathy and understanding even when we don't understand or agree with the protest. This doesn't mean that we're called to join alongside or fully in every protest in every circumstance, but it does mean that we need to aim for a kind of empathy and understanding and to recognize that these situations are seldom as clear-cut as they might seem. And in this particular issue, in this space, I've been in conversations with both certain activists and certain police officers around these very important issues, but there's very little room to sort of even begin to see the other perspective, and that we can be in those spaces to help with those conversations. The final example I'll mention is engagement in the area of religious liberty across difference. There are increasing legal challenges to Christian institutions and other religious institutions. Some of these are significant. There are challenges to campus ministries on colleges and universities. There are challenges to adoption and social service agencies. And there are even threats to certain educational institutions. It's important, I think, not to be naive about these challenges and to work in the legal and policy spaces to confront them. But importantly, in doing so, the case has to be made in publicly accessible terms. And it has to appeal to people of goodwill from a variety of religious faiths and of no religious faith. There's no principled legal or theological argument that looks only to the good of Christians. And unfortunately, in some of the current rhetoric and certain debates, you hear sort of a kind of religious exceptionalism that wants to be special interest protection for Christians. I think there are ways we can be more attentive to what religious liberty means for other people. So one example here, in the heyday of the Protestant culture that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there were many non-Christian Americans who grew up in the shadow of Christian prayers and Bible readings in public schools. And most of us know now that these practices have been long formally outlawed, except in reality in many cities and towns in the South, they're still doing it, right? And so one thought here is, what would it mean for Christians in, say, a town in the South where these practices are going on to start with, how does my atheist friend experience this? Or how does my Jewish friend experience this? And try to place empathy first in minority populations in places where Christians are the majority. I think the second area where it's essential for Christians to expand a notion of religious liberty in a pluralistic environment is on behalf of American Muslims. There are significant cultural and legal challenges confronted today by American Muslims. As one Muslim leader recently told me, Muslims are afraid to think in this country. Christians ought not claim the need for stronger attention to their own religious liberty without extending those same concerns to our Muslim neighbors. There are groups that are doing this well. The Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, Russell Moore of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, and others are taking very public stands on behalf of Muslims. But the dialogue and the discourse, as we know out there, has not gotten any better. And so we might ask what it would look like for Christians to engage with Muslim neighbors, to love them well, and to take the lead on defending their own religious freedom. There are good stories out there. There's a story from California of a group of Catholic nuns who escorted some Muslim kids to school because they were being harassed on the way to school. And we need, I think, more credible stories like that in order to sustain an argument for comprehensive religious liberty. This doesn't mean that we agree with every aspect of American Muslims or anyone else with whom we partner. It doesn't mean endorsing every value or every goal of other groups or other people, but it does mean drawing near to them and figuring out ways to work with them and to get to know them as actual partners and actual neighbors in our efforts. We can also do this with or without the constitutional protections that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. There's a great deal of work that has to be done in the legal and policy spaces. But whether we win or lose those efforts, we can still choose to model the civic practices of confident pluralism in our engagement with others, in our politics, in our efforts toward racial justice, in our defense of religious liberty. And we can pursue tolerance, humility, and patience, especially as Christians, because we ground our lives in faith and hope and love. So that's, I think, all I want to say about both civic practices and constitutional dimensions. It's a lot, I know, to throw at you, but I do look forward to questions and your engagement with these ideas, and happy to talk really about anything either that I covered tonight or that just came to mind in talking, and we'll turn it over to questions.